The wind cut sharp across the hilltop, carrying with it the sting of dust and the smell of dry earth. Clara Monroe stood still, her boots sunk into the brittle ground, her black dress tugging at her legs as if it, too, wanted to flee the weight of this place. Before her, the fresh mound of dirt stretched long and narrow, the pine cross hammered in crooked at its head. The letters of her husband's name had been carved quick, the edges rough, the lines uneven. It looked less like a tribute and more like a warning. Life didn't pause long enough for polish. Her hand lay heavy against her belly, round with the child she hadn't yet met but already feared to lose. Each flutter inside reminded her that she wasn't alone, though at times it felt more like a burden than a comfort. She breathed deep, steadying herself against the swirl of grief and the quiet terror of what came next. The neighbors had come, as they always did when the ground had to open for one of their own. They had stood shoulder to shoulder in muted silence while the preacher spoke words meant to soothe, though Clara barely heard them. She caught only fragments dust to dust, mercy, eternal rest floating on the wind like ash. When the final hymn ended, there were murmured condolences. Mrs. Hall, with her kind eyes and rough hands, pressed Clara's palm once, whispering something about God's will. Mr. Jenkins muttered that she was strong, stronger than most, before tipping his hat and looking away, as if ashamed of his own helplessness. A few more touches at her arm, a few more murmurs she could not remember. And then they drifted, one by one, back down the hill toward their wagons and horses, until only the sound of retreating hooves lingered against the wide silence. Clara didn't follow. She stayed, staring at the mound of earth that seemed to grow larger the longer she looked at it. Her husband lay there, a man she had known more for his absence than his presence. Still, he had been hers, and she had been his, and now all she had of him was a name carved on pine and a child waiting to be born. The ache of it pressed against her ribs like something too large to carry inside. The sky stretched endless above, pale blue fading into streaks of copper where the sun dipped toward the Dragoon Mountains. She remembered the first time she and William had ridden that ridge together, his laughter rolling easy, his promises as wide as the horizon. He had been charming then, careless in ways that made her heart quicken. Over time, that charm soured into recklessness, and the debts followed close behind. She had fought to keep the land, to patch what he had left undone, but now even death seemed to have collected what it was owed. A crow cried overhead, dark wings cutting the light. Clara shifted her weight, her free hand brushing the edge of her skirt. She wanted to kneel, to whisper something into the dirt, but no words came. What could she say that hadn't already been lost to the wind? That she forgave him for leaving her with more worry than love. That she feared raising a child alone in a world that looked at widows with pity and at unborn mouths with hunger? The silence stretched, broken only by the steady thrum of her heartbeat and the restless movement of the life inside her. She pressed her palm harder against her belly, grounding herself in that fragile proof of tomorrow. For a long while, she stood like that, a lone figure against the hill, her shadow long and sharp against the sinking sun. When she finally turned away, the grave behind her seemed to fold into the land itself, just another scar on soil already littered with them. She walked slow down the path, the weight of the child in her belly shifting with each step, the ache in her chest steady as the wind. Whatever waited for her at the ranch, it was hers alone to face now. And though her knees trembled, though the dust blurred with tears she refused to shed, Clara Monroe did not falter. The world might not favor widows or unborn children, but the world had not buried her yet. The sun was still high when Clara Monroe reached the edge of her land. She pulled the reins tight, slowing the horse as the ranch came into view. From a distance, it looked almost the same as it always had, a stretch of parched ground bordered by low hills, the house squatting stubbornly in the middle, a barn and corral leaning tired against the horizon. But up close, the truth showed itself plain. The fences sagged, posts leaning sideways like old men with bent backs. The barn roof had lost more shingles to the wind, leaving bare patches where rain could slip through. The corral gate hung crooked, one hinge rusted near through. She guided the horse past the dry creek bed, the place where water used to run thick in spring. Now it was cracked and lined with weeds, a hollow reminder of better years. Beyond it, 3 cattle grazed half-heartedly on what little grass remained. Their coats had dulled, ribs showing more than they ought to. She counted them automatically, lips pressed thin. Once, there had been nearly 20 head. Her husband had promised more, always talking of expansion, of new stock. Promises that rode off with him each time he left for town and didn't come back until the whiskey or the cards had spent him. Clara dismounted stiffly, one hand braced on her belly as her boots touched the dust. The child shifted inside her, as if restless with the jostle, and she drew in a steady breath. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice soft against the quiet. She brushed the horse's neck, led it toward the trough. The water was low there, too, warm and stale, a thin film floating at the edges. She added it to the growing list in her mind: refill the well bucket, fix the hinge, mend the fence, patch the roof. The list never seemed to shorten. The house greeted her with silence. Its clapboard walls were weathered gray, the porch steps worn hollow in the middle where years of boots had crossed. She stepped inside, setting her hat on the peg by the door. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, with a trace of stew long gone cold. The rooms were plain but neat, though everything bore the stamp of age. The table scarred by knives and plates, curtains faded from too much sun, floorboards creaking beneath her weight. She set about lighting the stove, more for the comfort of sound than for cooking. The child stirred again, pressing outward beneath her ribs, and she closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of what lay ahead, long nights heavy with crying, mornings filled with labor she already struggled to finish. Alone, always alone. She tried not to think of the barn roof or the sagging fence, tried not to imagine coyotes slinking in through the gaps or storms breaking through where the wood had rotted. But the thoughts came anyway, pressing down like the Arizona heat. She could mend small things, patch what needed patching, but she couldn't hold it all together, not with one pair of hands, not while carrying a child. The ranch was unraveling piece by piece, and she felt herself unraveling with it. Clara sank into the chair by the hearth, her palm resting on the swell of her belly. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the exhaustion in her eyes. The ranch was still hers by law, by blood, by sheer stubbornness, but as the evening shadows stretched across the walls, she faced the truth she had been pushing aside since the funeral. She could not do this alone. Not with the fences falling, not with the cattle thinning, not with the child coming. The land was a mirror of her own state, worn down, weather-beaten, and yet unwilling to give in. For now she would endure. Tomorrow she would rise before dawn, as she always did, and fight through the tasks until her hands blistered. But deep in her chest, beneath the stubbornness, she knew something had to change. Otherwise, she and the child would both be buried under the weight of this place before spring ever came. The evening sun slanted low across the land, gilding every ridge of dust and broken fence post in copper light. Clara Monroe was at the far edge of the pasture, tugging at the sagging gate with both hands, her breath sharp from the effort. The hinge had come loose again, the wood giving more with each season, and she could feel the weight of it dragging not just against the post but against her own bones. Sweat slipped down her temple, caught in the loose strands of hair that had fallen from her braid. The child pressed hard beneath her ribs as if protesting her stubborn labor, but she gritted her teeth and pulled anyway. The creak of leather reached her first, the rhythm of reins and saddle moving slow, deliberate. She straightened, her hand hovering near the latch, eyes narrowing toward the trail. A rider approached, tall in the saddle, his frame broad but lean, the kind of shape carved more by years of work than any concern for appearances. As he drew near, he slowed, one hand tipping his hat in a wordless greeting. "Evening," he said, his voice low, carrying the steadiness of a man who measured words before spending them. Clara's grip tightened on the gate. Evening, she replied, wary but firm. The rider dismounted with easy motion, boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. He stood a pace away, holding his hat by the brim, his hair darkened by sweat where it met his brow. His coat was trail-worn, dust clinging to every seam, yet there was no carelessness in the way he carried himself. His gaze went to the broken gate, then back to her, never lingering too long, never prying. "Looks like she's giving you trouble," he said. Clara turned back to the wood, jaw tight. "She always does." He crouched, running his calloused fingers along the hinge. "Could use a new post, but I reckon we could brace it for now." "Uh, we?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He only gave a small nod, as if the question needed no answer. Without waiting for permission, he pulled a length of rope from his saddlebag and set to work. Clara should have told him to stop, should have made it plain she didn't need a stranger meddling on her land, but the words caught in her throat. She watched as he looped the rope steady, his hands practiced, his movements sure but unhurried. Together, they worked in silence. She held the gate upright while he hammered a loose nail back into place, his shoulders flexing beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. The sound of metal striking wood echoed across the field, sharp and rhythmic, blending with the distant calls of evening birds. Clara's arms trembled from the effort, but she said nothing, neither did he. By the time the sun slipped low behind the hills, the gate stood straighter than it had in months. Elias Ward wiped the back of his hand across his brow, then picked up his hat, dusting it absently before setting it back on his head. "That should hold a while," he said. Clara stepped back, flexing her stiff fingers. "I didn't ask for help." "I know," he replied simply, his gaze steady but not pressing. "But it was needed." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving restless through the grass. Clara felt the weight of his presence, not heavy but unsettling all the same, stirring something in the quiet she had grown used to. She crossed her arms, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Much obliged," she said at last, the words tasting strange on her tongue. He gave a single nod, then mounted his horse with the same ease he had dismounted. With a tug on the reins, he started back down the trail, his figure fading slow against the rising dusk. Clara stood by the mended gate, her palm resting lightly on the wood. The ranch still felt worn, still falling apart at the edges, but the gate no longer leaned. And though she told herself it was only a kindness from a stranger passing through, she couldn't shake the way his presence lingered long after he was gone, pressing against her solitude like the first stirrings of an unfamiliar storm. The kettle hissed low on the stove, the scent of venison and beans curling through the small kitchen like smoke caught in rafters. Clara Monroe stood over the pot with the wooden spoon in hand, stirring slow, not because it needed it but because it gave her something to do with her fingers. Outside, the scrape of boots on the porch told her the stranger hadn't left after mending the gate. She should have told him to ride on, to take his courtesy elsewhere, but instead she had muttered the words before thinking an invitation that surprised even herself. "There's stew on the stove, if you want." Now there was no taking it back. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Elias Ward stepped inside, removing his hat with the respect of a man who hadn't forgotten his raising. He set it on the peg by the door, pausing a moment as though unsure of his welcome. Clara motioned toward the table without looking up from the pot. "Sit," she said simply, ladling stew into two chipped bowls. They ate in near silence, the lamplight swaying above them, shadows stretching long across the pinewood floor. Elias bowed his head briefly before lifting his spoon, but he offered no words. Clara kept her gaze on her bowl, focusing on the scrape of metal against porcelain, the warmth that rose with each bite. Every so often, her eyes drifted to him, broad shoulders bent over the table, hands scarred from years of work, face quiet in concentration. He didn't slurp or hurry. He ate like a man used to long days and simple meals, grateful but not grasping. There was something unsettling in his calm, as though the silence between them didn't bother him at all. Halfway through the meal, Clara shifted in her chair, her hand unconsciously resting against the swell of her belly. The child kicked, a small, insistent flutter that drew her breath sharp. She tried to move her hand away before he noticed, but Elias's eyes flicked up, catching the gesture. For a heartbeat, she braced herself for a question, for pity, for some remark about widows and children with no fathers, but none came. His gaze lingered only a moment, steady and unreadable, before he dipped his spoon again and returned to his meal. Clara let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When the bowls were empty, she rose to clear the table, stacking the dishes with practiced efficiency. "I'll wash these," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Elias nodded once, pushing his chair back with care. "I'll see to the fire then." He crossed the room, crouched near the hearth, and added a log with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged to the rhythm of simple tasks. Clara dried her hands on her apron, her chest tight with an ache she couldn't name. The house hadn't felt this full in years, not since William's laughter had echoed off these walls in the early days before it turned to arguments and debts. She pushed the thought away and murmured something about needing rest. Without waiting for reply, she slipped down the narrow hall toward her room, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath her boots. She had nearly closed the door behind her when she heard it, his voice, low and rough like gravel worn smooth by water. "Lord, give this little one strength," he whispered, the words meant for no ears but the fire's. "And give her mama more than her share of it, too." Clara froze, her hand on the doorframe, heart thudding against her ribs. She didn't move, didn't breathe, only listened as the silence swallowed his words. When she finally stepped into her room, the tightness in her chest had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't the same, either. For the first time since the funeral, the house did not feel entirely hers, and for reasons she could not yet admit, she did not mind. The days settled into a rhythm Clara hadn't expected. Elias Ward rose before the sun as if it were second nature, moving through chores without needing to be told where things belonged or how they were done. He mended fence rails, sharpened tools left to rust in the shed, patched leaks in the barn roof with hands that worked steady and sure. He never complained, never lingered in the house unless asked, and never spoke of payment. Clara had told herself each evening that she would send him on in the morning, but each dawn brought another broken thing that needed fixing, and each dawn she found him already working at it. She told herself she tolerated his presence for the sake of the ranch. She told herself it was only practical, nothing more. But practicality didn't explain the way she caught herself watching him from the porch as he lifted bales of hay with the ease of a man who knew muscle was meant for labor, not boasting. It didn't explain the way the silence between them no longer pressed quite so heavy. The week passed like that, each day dragging her further from the solitude she had wrapped around herself like a shield. On the seventh evening, the sky burned red and gold across the horizon, streaks of color spilling over the mesa as though the land itself were on fire. Clara stood by the corral, a bucket in her hand, while Elias leaned against the fence post, his shirt damp from sweat, hair tousled from the day's work. "You'll wear yourself thin if you keep at it like this," she said, the words sharper than she meant. He looked over at her, eyes calm, unreadable in the fading light. "A ranch don't keep itself standing." She set the bucket down, rubbing her palms against her skirt. "You've done more in a week than I could have managed in a month. But I didn't ask for it." "No," he agreed. He paused, gaze steady on her. "But it needed doing." Clara shifted, uneasy under his calm. The child pressed inside her, as if it sensed the weight of the moment. She folded her arms across her chest, ready to put up the wall she always did when someone got too close. But before she could, Elias spoke again, his voice plain, unvarnished. "Your child will need a father," he said. "And I want a family." The words hung in the air, as stark and simple as the fence post he leaned against. No sweet talk, no honeyed promises, just solid truth. Clara's chest tightened, a sharp ache that spread through her ribs. She turned away, eyes fixed on the sky where the last light bled into darkness. She remembered William's voice, easy and smooth, filled with big talk about futures that never came. She remembered the nights she waited at the table for him, stew gone cold, only to hear he'd lost his wages at cards, or spent them on whiskey. She remembered the coffin lowered into the ground, and the way the neighbor's eyes slid from hers, already pitying her for the burden of raising a child alone. Trusting another man felt like stepping off a cliff with no rope to catch her. And yet Elias had never once asked for more than a share of work and a place to set his hat. His words weren't a promise of riches or an escape from hardship. They were only an offering, something steady, something true. Clara swallowed hard, her hand slipping to her belly. The baby shifted, alive and insistent. She turned back to Elias, her voice low, almost breaking. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know enough," he said. "I know this land needs more than one pair of hands. I know you can't carry it all alone. And I know a child ought to grow up with someone willing to stand for him or her when the world comes calling." Clara's throat ached. She wanted to tell him no, to send him away before he rooted himself too deep in her life. But the words refused to come. Instead, she only nodded once, sharp and quick, as though that would end the matter. Elias didn't press. He only dipped his head, picked up the rope coiled at his feet, and started back toward the barn. His stride was steady, unhurried, like a man who had planted his words deep in the soil and was willing to wait as long as it took for them to grow. Clara stood by the fence long after he was gone, the last of the light fading into shadow. Her heart clenched, not from fear alone, but from something she had buried so deep she scarcely recognized it anymore: hope. The night after Elias spoke his piece, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling beams, her hand resting against the swell of her belly. The baby turned slow within her, a reminder that every choice she made now carried a weight far beyond herself. Elias's words echoed through her mind, plain and steady, the kind that couldn't be brushed off as easily as sweet talk. "Your child will need a father. And I want a family." He had said it like a man hammering in a post, one strike, firm and final. But her heart recoiled at the thought of binding herself again. She remembered William, her first husband, in flashes sharp as lightning. The promises he'd made on their wedding day, his arm snug around her waist, lips curved in a smile that had dazzled half the county. He had been all charm and fire then, filling her head with talk of land and cattle, of wealth just around the bend. And she, young and hungry for belonging, had believed every word. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. First came the whispers of late nights at the saloon, the poker games that stretched until dawn, the borrowed coins from neighbors she never saw repaid. Then came the fights, William storming through the door reeking of whiskey, jaw tight, eyes bright with a dangerous spark. He never raised a hand to her, but his fists found other men quickly enough. She had spent more nights than she could count sitting by a cracked window, waiting to hear the telltale scuffle outside, praying the sheriff wouldn't come knocking again. Debt piled like storm clouds on the horizon. Each season grew harder, the cattle fewer, the land hungrier. She mended fences alone, patched roofs while he slept off his losses. And still she stayed, because he was her husband, because she thought love was meant to endure everything, even a man bent on breaking himself. When the bullet found him, it was no surprise. Some saloon quarrel in Santa Cruz, a hand too quick on the draw. They brought his body home in the back of a wagon, and the pity in the neighbor's eyes cut deeper than grief. Widow Monroe, belly already round, left to face the dust and debts with nothing but her name and a failing ranch. Now Elias Ward stood at her gate, steady as stone, offering her something different, something solid. And still the ghosts whispered in her ear. What if he rode into town one day and never came back? What if he carried his own hidden vices, waiting for time to drag them into the light? What if she trusted again only to be left with another grave to visit, another set of promises turned to ash? The next morning, Clara found Elias mending the hinge on the chicken coop. She stepped onto the porch, arms folded tight, her voice carrying more sharpness than she intended. You think just because you fix a few boards, you know what this place needs? You don't know what it is to wake up wondering if today's the day the ground gives out from under you. I buried one husband already. I don't aim to bury another. Elias paused, hammer resting against the wood. He didn't look at her right away. When he did, his expression was calm, his eyes clear of judgment. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He only nodded once, slow, as if to say he heard every word. Then he turned back to his work, driving the nail in with one steady strike. The silence stretched long between them, filled only by the rhythmic sound of hammer against wood. Clara felt her throat tighten, the anger slipping into weariness. She had expected him to push, to argue, to promise he was different. Instead, he gave her nothing but patience, the kind that settled like a weight and made her chest ache. That night, as she banked the fire and the house fell still, Clara realized what unsettled her most. Elias Ward wasn't William. He didn't try to dazzle, didn't try to persuade. He simply stood, unshaken, letting her rage, letting her fear, as though he understood that trust was not something given in words. It was something earned, nail by nail, day by day. And that frightened her more than any ghost of the past, because part of her buried deep and stubborn wanted to believe him. The storm rolled in with a fury that seemed to rise straight out of the desert floor. One moment the sky was wide and endless, the late afternoon sun spilling gold over the hills. The next it was swallowed whole by clouds the color of iron. The wind came first, barreling through the valley, tearing dust from the ground and hurling it against the windows like handfuls of gravel. Clara stood on the porch, one hand braced against the post, watching as the horizon disappeared in a wall of grit and shadow. She had seen storms before, but something in the air told her this one meant to take more than it gave. The first crash came from the barn, a deep, groaning protest of timber against the gale. Clara's heart jolted. She pulled her shawl tight and hurried across the yard, skirts whipping around her legs. Elias was already there, rope slung over his shoulder, hammer in hand. His hair was plastered to his forehead, shirt dark with sweat and rain, but his eyes met hers through the chaos with the same calm steadiness she'd come to know. "Roof's lifting," he shouted above the wind. "If we don't brace it, we'll lose the whole wall." "I'll climb with you," Clara yelled back, voice raw. Elias frowned, already hauling the ladder against the side. "Too dangerous. Stay clear." She shook her head, planting her feet. "It's my barn. I'll not stand by while it tears apart." There was no time to argue. The wind howled around them, rattling the tin sheets like dice in a cup. Together, they scrambled up the ladder, boards, and rope, dragging at their sides. The rain came then, sharp as stones, stinging her cheeks and soaking her through within seconds. Clara pressed forward anyway, her fingers gripping slick wood as she crawled across the trembling roof. "Hold this corner," Elias called, tossing her one end of the rope. She caught it, knuckles white, and leaned into the gale with all the strength she had left. Each gust threatened to rip her loose, but she clung harder, the thought of the cattle shivering inside pushing her past fear. Elias hammered, each strike echoing like gunfire in the storm. The roof bucked beneath them, and Clara shifted to brace another corner. Her boot slipped against the slick plank, rotten wood giving way under her weight. For a breathless instant she pitched sideways, her skirt flaring like a torn sail, the world tilting into nothingness. Then a hand clamped around her wrist, hard and certain. "I've got you." Elias's voice cut through the roar, fierce and unyielding. His other hand gripped the beam, muscles straining as the storm tried to wrench her away. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps, her hair plastered across her face, the rain searing her eyes. But all she could see was him, his jaw set, his grip refusing to falter, his eyes locked on hers as if the storm itself would have to tear him apart before he let go. Her chest heaved, heart hammering wild. She clutched his arm with her free hand, dragging herself back onto the beam. They collapsed side by side against the roof, gasping, the storm shrieking above them. For a long moment neither moved, both too aware of how close she had come to falling, too aware of the warmth of his hand still braced firm against hers. Finally, Elias pulled away, pushing to his knees. "We finish it," he said, voice rough but steady, and she nodded, though her legs trembled. Together they hauled the last sheet into place, hammering, tying, bracing until the roof held solid against the wind. When they finally climbed down, soaked to the bone, the barn still stood, battered but unbroken. Clara staggered into the shelter of the doorway, rain streaming down her face like tears she hadn't chosen. Elias stood close, his hand brushing her arm as if to steady her. For the first time since William's death, she didn't feel the ground tilting beneath her. She felt safe, anchored not by walls or timber, but by the grip of a man who had refused to let her fall. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed close to the walls and made the ticking of the clock sound louder than it ought to. Clara stirred in her bed, the familiar ache in her back sharper this time, rolling through her in waves that stole her breath. At first she told herself it was nothing, just the child shifting again, the strain of another long day. But when the next pain came deep, insistent, drawing a low cry from her throat, she knew. The time had come. She gripped the bed frame, sweat beading at her temples though the night air was cool. Her voice broke in the darkness. "Elias." The door opened at once, lantern light spilling across the room. Elias stood there, eyes wide but steady, shirt half-buttoned from where he had clearly been dozing by the hearth. He crossed to her side in 2 strides. "It's starting?" Clara nodded, teeth clenched against another wave of pain. "Go. Fetch Mrs. Avery." He didn't hesitate. "I'll be back fast." She heard the thunder of boots on the porch, the sudden clatter of hooves tearing off into the night. Then the silence returned, broken only by her ragged breathing. She closed her eyes, whispering prayers she had nearly forgotten, each contraction pulling her deeper into the storm of her own body. Time blurred. She didn't know if it was minutes or hours before the sound of wheels and hooves returned. The door swung open, cold air rushing in with Elias and the midwife close behind. Mrs. Avery, brisk and unshaken, moved to Clara's side at once, setting down her satchel and pulling blankets free. Elias hovered near the door until the older woman snapped, "Don't just stand there, man, she'll need you." And so he came, settling at Clara's side, his rough hand enveloping hers. She felt the tremor in his palm, though his face stayed calm, his eyes locked on hers. "I've got you," he said softly. "You're not alone." The hours stretched long, punctuated by Clara's cries, by the midwife's firm instructions, by Elias's low murmurs of encouragement. Each time the pain surged, she squeezed his hand until her nails bit deep, but he never pulled away. Sweat drenched her hair, her throat raw from the effort, and more than once she thought she couldn't go on. But then Elias's voice would cut through the haze, steady, grounding, unyielding. "Breathe with me, that's it. You're stronger than this storm." At last, when she thought she had nothing left to give, the child's cry broke through the night. High and thin at first, then fierce, filling the room with life. Clara sagged back against the pillows, tears sliding unchecked down her cheeks. Mrs. Avery bundled the tiny form and placed him in Elias's arms first, for he was closer, his hands outstretched without even thinking. The hardened rancher's face broke, softened in a way Clara had never seen. His eyes shone wet in the lamplight as he cradled the infant against his chest, his thumb brushing over the child's downy cheek. "A boy," he whispered, his voice thick, "strong as they come." When he looked at Clara, there was no need for words. She saw everything in his expression: love that asked for nothing, devotion that needed no blood to bind it. He placed the child gently in her arms, his calloused hand lingering against hers as if to anchor them both. Clara gazed down at her son, his face red and scrunched, his tiny fists waving against the blanket. She pressed a trembling kiss to his brow, her heart swelling with a fierceness that nearly undid her. She glanced back at Elias, who still watched them as though the world had just been remade before his eyes. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt whole. Not because the road ahead would be easy, she knew it would not, but because she was no longer walking it alone. In the quiet after the storm, as the baby's cries softened into small whimpers and Elias's hand steadied hers, she understood. Whatever bound them now was not chance or obligation. It was choice. It was family, beginning here, in the dead of night, with a boy who had brought them both to their knees. The morning was still when they came, the kind of quiet that usually promised heat later in the day. Clara had been at the well, drawing up a bucket with one hand while her son dozed inside the house in a basket near the hearth. Elias was mending tack by the corral, his back bent to the work, when the sound of hooves broke the hush. 3 riders crested the rise, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. Clara froze, her hand tight on the rope. The men rode slow, deliberate, dust curling up around their horses' legs. Their coats were too fine for ranch work, boots polished, guns worn easy at their hips. The lead rider, a lean man with a narrow face and eyes that didn't smile, dismounted before the porch without so much as a nod. "Morning, ma'am," he drawled, tugging his gloves off finger by finger. "Name's Cutter. I represent certain interests out of Dry Creek. Seems your late husband left some business unfinished." Clara straightened, her palms slick on the rope. "My husband's dead. He left no business here but this land." Cutter chuckled low, shaking his head as though she were a child who didn't know her sums. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out. "Debt markers from the Green Table Club, Santa Cruz. Cards, whiskey, women, it all adds up. And according to this, he owed more than he owned. Which means we've got claim to settle it." Clara didn't take the paper. Her voice was tight, but even. "William never signed away this ranch. Maybe not on purpose." Cutter's gaze slid past her toward the house. "But a debt's a debt. We can take cattle, land, or—" He didn't finish. Elias had walked up from the corral, quiet as a shadow until his voice cut through, hard as iron. "That's far enough." Cutter turned, eyes narrowing. Elias stood between Clara and the men, broad-shouldered and unflinching, his hands loose at his sides but close enough to his belt to make the warning clear. "And you are?" Cutter asked, his smile returning but thinner now. "The man standing between you and what doesn't belong to you," Elias said. His voice carried the steady weight of a man used to backing his words. The other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, uneasy. Cutter's smile twitched. "Easy, friend. We came to talk, not to fight." "Then talk from the road," Elias said. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move a step, but something in his stance made the air taut as a drawn rope. "You wave your paper all you want, but you won't cross that line." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she couldn't take her eyes off Elias. He didn't glance back at her, didn't ask permission. He simply stood there, the storm she had nearly fallen from still alive in his bones, daring the syndicate to press further. Cutter's gaze flicked between Elias and Clara, measuring the ground. At last he refolded the paper, sliding it back into his coat with a shrug that didn't reach his eyes. "Suit yourself, but debts don't die with the man who made them. We'll be back, with more than words." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, the other 2 wheeling behind him. They rode off in a trail of dust, but the warning lingered in the air long after the sound of hooves faded. Clara realized she'd been holding her breath. Elias turned then, his eyes softening when they met hers. "They'll try again," he said, low but certain. She swallowed, her throat tight. "You stood in front of them like they'd have to go through you first." "They would," he said simply. "I'll not let them take what's yours. Or his." His glance flicked toward the house, where the baby's faint cry had just begun to stir. For a moment Clara couldn't speak. The fear was still there, sharp and biting, but it was tempered by something else, by the image of him standing between her and danger without a thought for himself. It was then she knew. Elias Ward wasn't just helping with broken gates and mended fences. He was already risking everything for her and the child, as if they had always been his to protect. And for the first time, the thought of not being alone no longer felt like weakness. It felt like strength. The first light of dawn crept slow across the valley, soft gold spilling over the jagged ridges and painting the dry earth with a glow that felt almost forgiving. The air was cool, the world hushed except for the low murmur of cattle shifting in their pen and the faint rustle of hens waking in the coop. The storm had passed. The syndicate's warning still clung like a shadow, but the ranch stood scarred, patched, stubborn as its mistress. Elias moved about the yard with a deliberate quiet, saddling his horse as though each motion were weighed in silence. The leather creaked under his hands, the cinch strap drawn tight. He adjusted it again, though it didn't need it, his jaw set in that steady way of his. The night before had left him restless, turning over in his mind the way Clara had looked at him after he stood between her and the men from Dry Creek. There had been something in her eyes, something softer than fear, but he didn't dare name it. Now, as the sun cracked open the horizon, Elias stood by his horse, reins coiled in one hand, hat still on his head. He wasn't running, but he wasn't certain he was meant to stay either. He had offered her what he could, plain and unpolished, but he knew a woman like Clara strong, weathered by loss, wouldn't give her heart easy. He wouldn't fault her for sending him down the road. The sound of the door opening pulled his eyes up. Clara stepped onto the porch, her shawl wrapped loose around her shoulders, the baby cradled against her chest. She moved slow, deliberate, her gaze fixed on him. The child shifted in her arms, a soft whimper stirring the stillness. She hushed him with a touch, her hand tender, in a way that made Elias's chest ache. For a long moment, neither spoke. The distance between them felt heavy, filled with all the words left unsaid. Then Clara took a step forward, then another, until she stood in the yard, the rising sun brushing her face with light. Her eyes met his, steady, unwavering. "You were right," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet like the strike of a bell. "My child does need a father." She paused, her fingers adjusting the blanket around the baby. "But more than that, I need a partner, and I reckon I've found one." Elias's throat worked as he swallowed, the reins loose in his hand. For a heartbeat he couldn't move, couldn't answer. Then he lifted his hat from his head, holding it low at his side, his gaze humbled, almost reverent. The wind stirred lightly between them, carrying the scent of sage and morning earth. Clara shifted the baby in one arm and reached out her free hand. Her palm was small compared to his, calloused from work, but steady as she offered it. Elias stepped forward, slow but certain, and took it in his own. His fingers closed around hers with the same strength he had shown on the roof, the same certainty that had faced down the syndicate, but this time there was no storm, no threat, only quiet, only promise. The baby stirred again, letting out a soft cry, and Clara pressed him close, her hand still linked with Elias's. The three of them stood in the pale light of morning, not a family by blood or inheritance, but by choice, by will, by the stubbornness of hearts that had been broken and had chosen to mend together. Elias exhaled, a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. Clara didn't speak again, nor did he. They didn't need to. The ranch stretched out before them, weathered but standing, and for the first time it didn't look like a burden to carry alone. Their first step forward was small, quiet, nothing the world would notice, but it was enough. It was the beginning.